All right, so you've learned about ISO. You've learned about aperture. You've learned about shutter speed for the last 3 videos that I put out. Now let's bring them all together. Here is the final series of your crash course. Okay, I'm excited. We've gone through 3 things. We've done our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed. You guys know what they are. You've probably played around with them on your camera by now. Great. Now let's learn how to work them all together. Your first priority should always be to make sure your image is properly exposed. You want to have your subject properly lit no matter what. Even if that means making your background a little too bright, you'll learn later how to balance those out. But in the first steps when you are just starting out with your new camera, make sure your subject is lit properly. The way you do that is by adjusting your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. The order in which you are to adjust them is your shutter speed and your aperture first, depending on what you're shooting. Your ISO should be the last thing you touch. You want to leave that as low as possible to avoid getting that grain. So, say I'm shooting a family portrait. We're outdoors. It's a cloudy day, but there's plenty of daylight. It's bright out. It's the middle of the afternoon. And I have a 50mm 1.8 lens, so I have a wide aperture to work with. I'm leaving my aperture at around 2.8, okay? My ISO is around 100. And I realize when I'm taking the pictures at 1/200th of a second, the images are coming out a little bit dark. 3 things I could do here. I could either bring down my aperture from 2.8 to maybe 2.0 or maybe 1.8, but then I risk losing some of the details. If there's multiple family members standing behind each other or in front of each other, that depth of field is going to get way too shallow. And some people can shoot at 1.8, they set people up properly. If you're working with a family that just wants to move around and be hugging on each other and taking different poses, you might not want to use an aperture that's that shallow. So my other option is to lower my shutter speed. If I'm already at 1/200 or 1/100, I really don't want to go much lower, just in case they blink, they move. You're going to get that little tiny bit of motion blur that's going to keep your picture from being tack sharp. So your third option, your final option, is going to be to raise your ISO. If I'm at ISO 100, I can comfortably bring that up to ISO 400. That's going to give me a lot of extra light in those pictures with not a lot of grain and not a lot of noise. That is a good way to go about it. Now, alternatively, say I could lower my shutter speed, go ahead and do it. Say you could lower your aperture, go ahead and do it. Anything that you could do before moving that ISO, do it. What you're trying to do is every time you change one thing, you want to try to change something else if you're losing your exposure. If you're making a change just to properly expose, that's fine. But if you have exposure and you're saying, I need a little more shutter speed because there's too much movement, or I need more depth of field, so I need to close down the aperture a little bit, then you're going to have to change something else to compensate. So remember, if you already have something properly exposed and now you're making a change because of outside factors that you can't control, you're going to have to change something else. For example, you're shooting sports, okay? You took some pictures of the players as they were warming up, everything was fine. Now the game is on and there is a lot of movement. People are moving fast and you realize, I'm getting some motion blur here. I need a faster shutter speed, but my aperture is already wide open and I can't close it down anymore. I'm going to lose too much light. I'm indoors. So you would increase your shutter speed to where you need it, probably 1/500 or 1/1000. And if you can't change your aperture at that point, your image is going to be very, very dark. So you're going to have to bump up your ISO. So you bump up your ISO to around 1600 or even 3200. You're going to get some grain, some noise, but that's not going to matter because your image is now going to be properly exposed and it's going to be visible. And you could always fix a little bit of noise in post-production. It's better to do a little bit of noise reduction later than it is to shoot underexposed and bring up the exposure and the brightness later, because that really looks unnatural most of the time. I've always found that shooting underexposed is not the way to go when it comes to doing a lot of your shots, especially my wildlife shots. A lot of these shots I started out taking underexposed, and the problem is when I shot them underexposed and brought them up, I lost so much color and I lost so much contrast and detail. Everything was just a shade and a shadow. The contrast just wasn't there. When I started shooting with a higher ISO and I needed it, everything kind of came together. So here is your priority one more time. No matter what you're doing, no matter what you're shooting, if you need a higher shutter speed, take a higher shutter speed. But you're going to have to either lower your aperture to allow more light in, and if your aperture is already at its lowest setting, or you can't lower it anymore due to the kind of shot that you're taking, you're going to have to raise your ISO. Okay? If you need more depth of field in your photo and you have to close down your aperture, that means moving your aperture up to a larger number and allowing less light in, you're going to have to lower your shutter speed to allow your sensor to gather more light. So you're balancing off what you just did with your aperture. If you can't lower your shutter speed because of what you're shooting, or it's going to cause too much motion blur, then you bump up your ISO. Here's how your mind needs to be working while you're shooting and changing settings on the fly. I need to change my shutter speed. So I change my shutter speed. In order to compensate for what I just did, I'm going to have to change my aperture. If I'm making the image brighter with my shutter speed going lower, I'm going to have to make my aperture smaller in order to allow less light and balance out where I was. On the other side, if I'm changing my aperture because I need more of a depth of field, I'm allowing less light into the camera. I'm going to have to use a lower shutter speed to allow more light into the camera and balance out my last change. And if any of those don't work, or you run into a wall where you say, I can't change my shutter speed right now because of the motion, and I can't change my aperture right now because of the depth of field that I need, that is when you turn around and bump up your ISO. This is as simple as I could put it. I didn't want to go into any real technical details with this one. I just wanted to explain to you guys how my mind works when I'm shooting. You'll get a knack in the field for, well, I just took down my aperture and opened it up wide. I'm going to raise my shutter speed to bring that brightness back down. And a good thing too, if you're using a mirrorless camera, like I use a Nikon Z5, as you make the adjustments, it shows you exactly where the exposure is, which takes a lot of the guesswork out. So if you have a mirrorless camera, or you have a friend who has a mirrorless camera, reach out to them and see if they could let you play around with it for a little while. It'll really give you a good grasp on how aperture, ISO, and shutter speed actually work. Other than that, I hope you guys watched all these videos. I want to thank one final time to GrizzTuff. I know I've mentioned in the last 3 videos, but you're going to hear about it for the 4th time. They were nice enough to send me this hat and this shirt and a couple other goodies, some stickers and some koozies. The kindness of their own hearts. They did not sponsor this video in any way. I just wanted to return the favor and let people know about them. The link for them is going to be in the description. They have some great apparel. Definitely check them out. Also, if you want to see some of my photographs, my wildlife photography is at dom.iwc on Instagram, and I put all of my settings with my ISO, my shutter speed, and my aperture settings, as well as my lenses and my camera settings, just to help you guys learn at your own pace. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this series. I hope it helped you out. You can check out my other videos if you haven't already watched them on ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. You should have watched those already before you watch this one. It'll give you a much better understanding. So if you were missing anything in this video that you didn't quite understand, go back and watch those 3. They're quick, and they will really explain everything in a very concise and clear fashion. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.